Hello, everyone. Today, we'd be discussing the study that was conducted by Fagen et al. In the year 2014. This study was about learning techniques. This study was about positive reinforcement. This study was about operant conditioning. And this study specifically had to do with the usage of secondary positive reinforcement, or the SPR training technique, through which researchers were trying to acquire the sample for to be able to test. They were trying to acquire a sample to be able to test elephants for tuberculosis, that is TB. Now, taking this study ahead, now before we even start discussing this, I'd like to assume you've all been done through this study. You've all understood the study well. Now, taking this ahead, if we talk about this particular study, this is a controlled observation. This is a controlled observation. Remember, we had discussed this earlier. This particular study, this is not an experiment. For a study to be an experiment, there has to be an independent and a dependent variable. They were not used over here. There was no IV or DV in this study, right? This study could be referred to as a controlled observation, also could be referred to as a structured observation, right? So getting started with the controlled observation part, the first strength that we'll be discussing over here is, now this study that was conducted by Fagen, this was the data was collected through a controlled observation, such as this could be easily replicated using the same observation schedule. Now, this means that the study could be tested for reliability. Now, have a look at this. Do you realize the more controlled your environment is, the more standardized your procedure would be, right? Controlled environment would result in controlled observation. Controlled observation would result in your study being replicated or repeated, right? If things are in control, and if the environment in which the research is being conducted is controlled by the researcher, it would be easier for the researcher to be able to replicate the study, right? Now, what was being replicated over here? What could have been replicated easily over here? The observation schedules that were used, right? Now, this means that the study could be tested for reliability. Now, it's very simple. You should remember this, and this pretty much works for almost all the studies. The more controlled your environment is, the more standardized your procedure would be. The more standardized your procedure would be, the more easier it would be for you as a researcher to replicate your research or to redo your research in exactly the same manner. And if you're able to redo your research in exactly the same manner, the likelihood of the findings being more reliable is always high. Let me remind you all what the term reliability means. When we use the word reliability, reliability has to do with the extent to which a research is repeated or replicated and the researcher comes up with the same results, right? So the first advantage over here is controlled observation. Number two, the second observation, the second strength to be discussed here. If we talk about the second strength, there were attempts to maintain the validity of the research. For example, the mahouts were asked to not speak or give signals to the elephants. Now, I'd like to assume we all remember who mahouts are. These were the helpers or the caregivers or the caretakers of the elephants, right? Now, when we talk about these mahouts, they were present when the researchers were collecting data. Of course, we're talking about elephants. Elephants, they're huge. They're big animals that could potentially be dangerous. So it was good to have the mahouts over there for the safety for the trainers, right? For the trainers and the researchers who were collecting data. So to be able to attempt to maintain the validity of the researcher, the mahouts were given clear instructions as to not to speak or give any sort of signals to the elephants while data was being collected or while they were being trained, right? Now, how is this an advantage? This particular point is an advantage over here because remember, these elephants, all of these five elephants, they would be well acquainted with their own respective mahouts, right? They'd been knowing these mahouts well. So any sort of communication between the mahouts and the elephants at this point could have affected data collection. And if it would have affected data collection, that in other words means the responses received from the elephants that were to be noted, they could have been affected, right? Which eventually would have affected the credibility or the validity of the research. So the second advantage over here was mahouts not being allowed to communicate with the elephants, right? This was done to to increase the validity, to increase the credibility of the research, to ensure that this extraneous variable does not affect the findings. Now, moving on to the third advantage. If you have a look at the third advantage over here, the verbal cues that were given. The verbal cues given had no meaning in Nepalese or English. These controls limited the influence of demand characteristics on the elephant's responses to the tests. Now, remember, the verbal communication or the verbal cues with the elephants was through a word, right? A single syllable word. Nonetheless, the researchers ensured that the word that was being used as a cue did not have any meaning in the Nepalese language or in English, right? This was done to be able to maintain more of control, right? More of controls, remember, is an advantage, right? So these controls limited the influence of demand characteristics on the elephant's response to the test, right? Now, imagine for a bit if these animals, they would have been communicated with any word that had any meaning in the Nepalese or the English language, this could have affected the results of the research, right? These verbal cues, which already did have a meaning, this might have affected the way the elephants were responding, which was, of course, not something that the researchers would have wanted or liked, right? The researchers did not, and hence what the researchers did was they chose a word that did not have any meaning in English or Nepalese. And this, of course, increases the levels of controls that the researcher has. Remember, my dear, the more controls, the higher the validity of a research. The next point now, taking this ahead, if we move on to the fourth advantage, a structured observation was used. The study collected quantitative data in the form of correct behavioral responses to the verbal cues or offers. This allows to make an objective analysis of whether or not the SPR was a successful method for learning the trunk wash. Now, a few important things over here from this particular point uh, that I'd like to specify. Number one, we need to know what SPR means. SPR, my dear, over here refers to secondary positive reinforcement techniques, right? So there was structured observation. Remember, in a structured observation, there's a checklist. There are certain behavioral responses that are pre-decided by the researchers. And while collecting data, the researchers ensure, or they try to ensure, or the researchers try to see or to have a look at the extent to which those behaviors have been performed, right? So a structured observation was being used. Remember, if a structured observation is being used over here, all the strengths and the weaknesses that you know of the structured observation could be put to use, right? So a structured observation was used over here. The study collected quantitative data, numeric data. Numeric data is easier when it comes to analysis. Numeric data is easier when it comes to interpretation. Numeric data is easier when it comes to operationalization. Numeric data saves us a lot of time. Numeric data is easily replicable. If it's easily replicable, the reliability of the research can possibly increase, right? So a structured observation was used over here. There was data collected through quantitative data, right? It was quantitative in the the data was collected in a quantitative or a numeric form, in the form of correct behavioral responses to the verbal cues. Now, what happens if you use structured observation? If you're using structured observation, you gain quantitative data. If you gain quantitative data, it makes a lot of things easier for you as a researcher, right? Now, at the same time, this adds on to the objectivity of the findings, right? Now, if a structured observation, if I may give you an example over here, structured observation of the number of times someone has yawned in a classroom, right? That could be more objective, because if someone's yawning, it's easier relatively for the researcher to be able to pick on anything that is structured or predetermined, right? So objectivity, what does the word objectivity mean? The word objectivity means where there is no biasness, right? So if the data is being collected through a structured observation and the data is collected through quantitative means, the likelihood of your research not being affected by biasness is higher, right? So your research could be more objective. So this allows us to make an objective analysis of whether or not the SPR, that is secondary positive reinforcement method, was a successful method for learning the trunk wash. Now, these were 4 different advantages over here. Let's quickly move on to the 5th one. Objective analysis of whether or not the SPR was successful method for learning the trunk wash is possible. Now, through this particular research, it was learned that it was figured out that an objective analysis or an objective mean without bias could be used to test for the effectiveness of the SPR training technique. So, my dear, there are 5 different advantages that we discussed here. And the first one was about the usage of controlled observation leading to replication, leading to increase or higher chances of reliability. The second point over here was about how the mayhouts were given instructions as to not to speak that would consequently affect the or increase the validity of the research. The third advantage was of the higher amount of controls, the higher amount of controls that were used by the researchers by not using words that had any meanings and meaning in Nepalese or English language, which would can keep the research away from any sort of demand characteristics affecting it. Number 4, there was a structured observation use, which led to quantitative data, which allowed for an objective analysis. Number 5, us knowing that an objective analysis is possible when it comes to testing the effectiveness of SPR technique. I hope these advantages are well understood. Let's quickly move on towards the weaknesses of the study. The first weakness, this study involved a small group of female elephants. Remember, my dear, there were only female elephants research, only female elephants as a part of the sample where this data was being collected. Out of these 5 female elephants, 4 of them were young juveniles or younger elephants, and 1 of them was an adult. Now, if you're using a small group of female elephants, that might affect the representativeness of the sample. And remember, the representativeness of the sample affects the generalizability of the findings, right? I've said this, I've explained this numerous times earlier. When we speak about the sample, we use the term, typically we use the term representativeness, right? The sample needs to be representative of the target population. If the sample is representative of the target population, that eventually or consequently leads to the findings of the research, or the results of the research being high in terms of generalizability, right? Generalizability. So very simple, if the sample is representative of the target population, the chances that the findings would be more applicable or generalizable, they're higher. So since there was a small group of elephants, only 5 of them from which the data was collected, since a small group of elephants were used and they were all females, this might make it difficult to generalize the findings to a larger population of elephants. Moreover, these elephants, they were all captive animals from one stable, right? They were all from one particular stable in Nepal, right? These were all captive animals. And of course, if you're talking about collecting data from a single stable, you cannot really generalize the findings on a wider population of elephants elsewhere, especially when you talk about the elephants in the wild, in the jungle. So collecting data from a single stable is a disadvantage. Collecting data from a small group of elephants is a disadvantage because the sample is pretty tiny. Collecting data from only females is a disadvantage because you cannot really apply the findings on males. You cannot really apply the findings on the wider population of elephants from the wild, and you cannot really apply. Yeah, I think that's it. So the next one, the researcher mentions that elephants were chosen for their temperament. So you are Fagen et al., they've been very clear about this, that the animals that were chosen, one of the factors was about their temperament or their nature, right? They had to be docile, they had to be the calm ones, right? And if you deliberately, of course, they were looking for animals, they were looking for elephants that were more calm because they did not want the research findings to be messed up, right? They would wanted the animals to cooperate. So if you're choosing animals who are more cooperative, more calm, more docile, don't you think the findings of this research might not be applicable on animals who are not docile, who are not calm? right? So another factor, so the researcher mentions that elephants were chosen for their temperament. I mean, it was for the temperament and the availability of the mayouts as well. So yeah, the researcher mentions that elephants were chosen for their temperament. I hope you guys get the second disadvantage. Moving on to the third one. Because of the large size, elephants can pose a risk to themselves and to humans, which is a major challenge for those conducting research with them. Of course, about elephants, elephants are huge, like I mentioned earlier. They're large animals, and they could end up hurting themselves, which is not right. They could end up hurting uh because you were making them do something that was unusual. We understand that the researchers were trying to use positive reinforcement techniques, and they were doing it for the better welfare of the elephants. They were doing it with all the good intentions. Nonetheless, these animals are animals. There's the possibility of them not cooperating and potentially being dangerous not only for themselves but for other humans, including the researchers as well. So moving on, the fourth disadvantage, practical challenges included trying to controlling for distractions to the elephants. Of course, while collection of data, since this data was collected in the stable, and there were other tourists that were visiting there too, and the possibility that other elephants would interact with these elephants and make collection data a tougher job. So practical challenges were there as well, including trying to control for distractions to the elephants, the presence of tourists. I'll just highlight this as well. And other elephants during the training session might have affected the elephant's concentration or willingness to participate, of course. So, control of distractions, presence of tourists, and other elephants during the training session might have affected the elephant's concentration level, right? Or the willingness to participate. The next one, the researchers state that the training sessions were flexible. So, there was flexibility in the training sessions. So usually flexibility is seen as a good thing as then or as an advantage, but you do realize if there's flexibility in terms of data collection technique, your standardization of the procedure gets compromised. You cannot, the more flexibility there is, the lesser chances there are that the data could be collected in a standardized manner. And the lesser the standardization of the procedure, the lower the reliability, right? The procedure needs to be standardized. The procedure needs to be standardized to be able to uh, to be able to replicate the research. And when you replicate the research, the likelihood or the chances of reliability get higher. So the researchers state that the training sessions were flexible to suit the mood and the ability of each animal, which may reduce standardization of the procedure and thus affect the validity of the research. So we spoke about 5 different disadvantages quickly, the last one, and then we're done. So it is likely that the experience of the trainer and the personality of conditions in which the elephants were kept, that is the level of stress, the previous experience of SPR training could have affected the results. So the experience of trainer is a factor that could not have been controlled. The personalities, their conditions, the living conditions, and the time when the data was collected. If you remember, the data was collected during 2 different intervals. And if you do not really recall this, uh, pretty comprehensive video on this that I recorded, and I put it here for about around 2 hours. You might as well go through that so you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, what I was saying is the training conditions, the time at which the data was collected, the time at which these SPR training sessions were held, all of these could be factors that could have affected the findings of the research. Now, I just generally tried to explain you a few strengths and limitations of the study that was conducted by Fagen et al. In the year 2014 that had to do with animal learning, elephant learning, in fact. So, how do these strengths and weaknesses help us? This enhances understanding of this study. Not only that, knowing these would help us write better evaluative answers, write better evaluative answers. So we typically get a 10-mark question in our CIs. So yeah, it is a 10-mark question out of a 60-mark paper. So I'm just writing this so that you know this is important, where we expected to write down, or where we expected to evaluate the study in terms of two strengths and two weaknesses. This question, these points that we discussed over here could help you write these answers better. Of course, there's a specific way to write a particular strength and weakness, where I believe as a student, you're expected to identify that strength first. Number two, you're expected to link it with the study, link it, that is that particular strength or weakness, link it with the study. And number three, to write down how it affects the overall credibility of that of the research. So this is a criteria that I typically advise students to use or to keep in mind. Remember, I just mentioned for a single point, my dear, you're expected, this is a single point, right? For a single point, you are expected to cater to all three of these requirements: identify that strength or weakness, link it with the study, and write down how it affects the overall credibility of the study. So I'd be explaining this further in another video. I hope this one has helped. Take good care of yourselves. Stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected. Stay humble. Spread positivity, spread smiles, and Allah Hafiz.